I would like to then just bring to the podium one of my heroes. I've always wanted to read a lot and study a lot. And some of the things that I managed to read are those things that Dr. Ogletree has written. And so every time I get a chance, I read something that he has written, and I'd like to bring to the podium to introduce Justice Breyer, the Honorable Charles Ogletree, Jr., Executive Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at the Harvard School of Law.
Thank you very much, Congressman Davis, and all the other members of the Congressional Black Caucus for sponsoring this, and someone who, in his own unmatched way, will both state the problem and the solution when we think about what do we need to do to address the problems of sentencing, and do so from his experience as a judge, as a legislative assistant, as a jurist, and as a citizen who understands these things in very important ways. So someone who has not only walked the walk but talked the talk. Won't you please join me in welcoming to the podium Justice Stephen Breyer.
I'm very glad to be here, Mr. Attorney General and Mr. Chairman and members of Congress and everyone, judges and everyone else who's here. It's not just that I escaped that office for a few minutes. We are in the last week, which is a total nightmare as compared to other weeks, which are a comparative nightmare. But the fact is that this is not the greatest time, but it is nice to be here. And I'll tell you why. I'm going back to basics. I did work for Senator Kennedy, and when we tried to write the legislation that led to the guidelines, everybody was for it. Everybody. Republicans and Democrats. The number of opposition you could count on one hand. Why? I want to remind some of you, and some of you weren't even born then, of course, but I would like to remind you why. Because that's what I'd call a basic. The basics, and it's not lost, the basics that brought people together is finally we will have an institution that's fairly visible, that instead of focusing on whether this individual is guilty or innocent, we'll focus on what do we do with this human being. And the reason that that's significant is because 95, 96, 97% of those accused of federal crimes, and in the states the numbers I bet are comparable, they plead guilty. So you can give them all the rights on paper you want, they are not going to use them. They are going to plead guilty, and then the question becomes, well, A, how do we know they were right to do that? But that's a different problem we're not talking about. And B, what do we do with this human being? So we said, we're going to set up an institution over here that will focus on that question. Bravo. Let's focus. I'm not sure we've got it quite right so far, but there's no reason that we can't focus. All right, that's why I'm glad I'm here, because you are focusing on the question. And from my legal perspective as well as personal, that's the right question, a very important one. Now let me add one, what I call basic, for each of really the three institutions that you have here. This is nice. I think usually people just listen to any of my wild ideas when I write them down in paper and get four others to join them. That's never, so I'm happy to give you a few. But what would I say to the judges? Very basic. I'd say two things. I'd say, please, first, remember what the idea, the philosophy was underlying these guidelines, whether it's been beautifully implemented or not. Go back to the basic philosophy. Because now, because of certain Supreme Court opinions, maybe Booker and some others, you can do it. Now what's the it? The idea was very simple. Judge, if that man or woman in front of you is committing a typical crime in a typical way, follow the guideline, because that's what it's supposed to be. And if you don't think it is, write them a letter, get them to change it. That's a separate thing. Okay, but that's what it's supposed. But judge, if you think that what's going on here is wrong in respect to this person, depart. Don't give him the sentence. Write your reasons down. You got to write your reasons down, and they'll be reviewed in the Court of Appeals. But don't give a sentence you think is wrong. Depart and give your reasons. You might be reversed. Which of us isn't? I'm not, by the way. That's the theory of it. And when we wrote those guidelines initially, it was a it turned out to be so much more difficult than people thought. But when we wrote them initially, our idea was, and we looked at 35,000 pre-sentence reports and 10,000 in detail, and we thought we had, through computers and everything, an idea of what really happened to people. And they were all over in the corner. There was this wonderful woman who was Helen Carruthers, and she used to say, we're learning all this from the corner, because in the corner were the printouts. And what the printouts told us is what time was really being served by people who really engaged in certain behaviors. And we tried, roughly, to get the guidelines to reflect what had been happening. Well, there's a lot of water over the dam since then, and we didn't even do it perfectly right by any means then. But the idea was, you see, do the typical when you have the typical. And you don't like it, depart. And all I want you to keep in mind is now you really can do that. Now, if you want my off-the-record meaningfully, yeah, this is a good place to go off the record. But I'll say it's not authoritative in any way, not authoritative estimate. I thought, and some of us thought what would happen, is we would see downward departures, let's say, maybe 15 to 20% of the time. Well, it didn't get anywhere near that for a variety of reasons. If it went up to 30, 35%, you'd get worried, because what you're having over here maybe is Judge A and Judge B who have identical cases, and they're treating them differently, and that's a non-uniformity. But you can tolerate some non-uniformity. No such thing as perfect uniformity. You get too much uniformity, treat everybody alike, you're forgetting to treat different people differently. You got to treat like people alike, different people differently. Okay, but anyway, you see the point. You now have the opportunity to depart, so depart, if you think it's the right thing. And write your reasons down. All right, keep that in mind. By the way, what's supposed to happen when you depart? You'll appeal, the Court of Appeals may reverse you. But even if they do reverse you, the Sentencing Commission is supposed to be over there to keep track of what's going on and revise the document accordingly. Okay, so even if you're reversed, you've contributed something to the process. Okay? That's the first thing. By the way, I'd like you to keep one other thing in mind, Judge. Please, this is hard to keep in mind, but you'll see why I say it. Please, there is a difference between a guideline sentence and a mandatory minimum. And why do I say that? It's invisible to the judge. The judge doesn't see it. He just sees that book. But the book where there's a mandatory minimum is being driven by an act of Congress, which is called a mandatory minimum. You didn't do it. But I say that Congress has quite a few of them. And statutes trump the guidelines. That's invisible to the judge, but it's true. And if you don't keep that in mind, you will blame the wrong victim. I mean, you'll say it's the guidelines' fault when it's actually the mandatory minimum. You'll see why I say that. All right. Second actor in this, the Sentencing Commission. Informal advice to the Sentencing Commission? Just what the Attorney General said. Today is a new day. Today is a new day. You can, in fact, begin, if you haven't already, to collect not just this information you've been collecting, not just what the Court of Appeals does, not just what the district courts do, but it's certainly good to do that, but you have it in your power to do all kinds of things and find out all kinds of things. We used to have something called intermediate punishments. Why were they called intermediate punishments? That sounds tough. It is tough, but it doesn't mean prison. Maybe for some people, the right thing was boot camps. Maybe it was night and weekend in prison. Maybe it was some kind of training program. Maybe it was a drug program such as Sandra O'Connor and I saw with the Spokane tribe in the state of Washington, where that tribe had one of the best programs we have seen. And there are all kinds of things all over the country. So find out about them. Write about them. Remember, the basic goal is, what do we do with this human being? And there's a lot of authority in the commission to look at that in many different ways. So that's what I would say. Today is a new day. Good. It's a new day. Let's think of new ways i.e., let's do some empirical work and other work to think of how we might go about some of this. The only other advice which I hesitate to give, but I'll do it. I hesitate to do it because I'm a lawyer. And I say beware to the commission. Beware of the legal mind. Beware of the legal mind. How are we going to earn a living? The reason I say beware of the legal mind is because the legal mind loves to make distinctions. And pretty soon, you start with a book that's this thick, and you end up with a book that's that thick. Now, I learned something when I was on the commission from an economist, or a conservative economist named Michael Block, who made one comment that made me think. He said, you know, God doesn't tell us the right punishment. And as long as that's so, don't try and produce documents that say what that punishment is up to 19 decimal points. Don't keep making distinctions. Leave room in this document for judges to do a little bit of variation, even within the guidelines, when they're applying them. What would I love to tell Congress? Oh, this makes me very nervous. I guess if I had my choice, it would be, and I don't have my choice, because what would I love Congress to focus on? Of course, it's obvious why I said that by now. Mandatory minimums. My goodness, those mandatory minimums drive guidelines in 100 different ways. And if you have a mandatory minimum, and there's some man who's lying, 18 years old, and he's just across the border, and somebody says, here's $200, go drive this truck across the border, and lo and behold, it has 425,000 kilograms of cocaine or something. I mean, bye. Okay, I mean, do you see? That's not necessarily the case where you want the typical guideline sentence. Now, it's not just a question of leniency. It is also a question of when you discover that you're trying to apply mandatory minimum guidelines, which you have to, mandatory minimums, to cases that don't call for it, and a study showed this at the commission, you get less punishment, not more. What? You say, how could that be possible? The guideline, mandatory minimum, calls for a very higher sentence, but the studies show that often people get lower sentences? How? You're forbidden to depart. And the reason is that if judges, juries, or prosecutors see something in front of them in the law that looks too unjust, they will try to find a way. The jury might not convict. The judge may somehow figure it out. I don't know. I'm not saying they do. But the prosecutor may work out a way. And I say to the prosecutors, is that the kind of system you want? Because that isn't necessarily a system that extracts fair and definite punishment for those who deserve it. So I think if I had my choice number one for Congress would be mandatory minimums, and I know that is absolutely a Herculean effort because it's very, very hard to explain to people that that doesn't mean you are not for punishing criminals. It means that you trust the organization you set up, namely the Sentencing Commission, to go into this in enough depth that they're not going to be overly lenient, but they are going to be rational. And that, it seems to me, maybe you can go somewhere with that argument. I don't know. That's not my job, and it's a hard job to do that. But I think that's where the body's buried. And I think I'd try to begin there. And of course, the other thing, my goodness, if you can encourage the Commission to look into these things that I've mentioned, a few of them, alternative punishments, ways of seeing that there are ways of dealing with crime effectively that don't just encompass always more, that there are many different imaginative things that can be done, that's not being soft on crime, that is trying a rational approach that ties the punishment to the crime. So, there we are. I'm back at the beginning. I see this, and I was happy, as I said, to hear the Attorney General say it. It's a new day. There are institutions we can work with, and my goodness, they're going to require work, but I remain an optimist. Thank you.